This evening, so it sets the scene for Iceland, which is also wet and chilly and among other things, very hot at times. And lovely to see you all here. I'm glad you managed to make it. And hope you've all got a drink and settle down. And we're going to start off with soup.
So welcome everybody, and just to set the scene, why are we talking about Iceland? Good question, Mark Stead. I mean, we were very fortunate enough to go to Iceland last December as a family, just for 4 days. We were fortunate to have a free COVID flight to the UK, and therefore we then thought, let's do something different. So we then went from the 4th to the 8th of December to Iceland with our family. So Iceland is a land of contrast. Fire and ice, light and dark, hot and cold. It really is just a dramatic, magical country. And for us coming from South Africa, in summer to their winter, when you only have 4 hours of light. But a lot of you would have heard about Iceland because it's been in the news, and we just wanted to just show you why it's still in the news.
Another volcanic eruption in Iceland, but this one is hitting a little too close to home. Reports say it's the third time there's been a volcanic eruption on this peninsula since December, and the lava flow has engulfed a pipeline, cutting some communities off from heat and hot water. It's also forced one of the country's biggest tourist attractions to close. Visitors from all over the world come to the Blue Lagoon to experience the country's geothermal spa culture. Officials are now trying to stop the lava flow from causing further damage. They're also asking people and businesses to conserve electricity until they can repair the pipeline, which could take days. This eruption is not far from Grindavik, a town of less than 4,000 people that was evacuated in November after warnings of an imminent eruption by a volcano of the same name. The eruption finally happened in December. Officials say they don't know if people will ever be able to return to live in Grindavik, since volcanic eruptions can go on for years, even decades.
So, Grindavik, you fly into Keflavik, and Grindavik is here, 20 kilometers away. So actually, when we went there in December, it hadn't actually erupted at that stage. It was still just splitting, and we could just see a little bit of it. Why is it splitting? Because Iceland is on the two tectonic plates, the North American and the Eurasian meet right across the country, and it evolved out of those two tectonic plates. So it's actually one of the newest it's the newest country in the world. It's been relatively recent. So here you can actually see the two plates, and you can actually walk between them. So Iceland has got a huge variety. This area here makes up 10%, is a huge glacier. 11% of the country is glaciers, 10,000 waterfalls. My son will think we saw most of them in our 4 days, but there's a lot of waterfalls. The amount of water, very rare, varies a lot. So from Reykjavik, you might only have 800 mils for the year, down to Vik, where you can have 2,200 millimeters. So a great variety in a very small area. 30% of the land is lava fields, and 130 volcanoes. It's basically made up of a jigsaw of volcanic action. So they're dotted all over the country. But in winter, most people come down to this area. You can actually, it's really bizarre. I thought it was bizarre. That you go to they built in a shopping mall over a tectonic plate, and you can actually stand over the two, which obviously they shows how well they construct their buildings there, the faith that they have that it's going to withstand everything. So And so, but as we said earlier, it's in the news because of volcanoes.
Right, so there are more active volcanoes concentrated in Ireland than anywhere else on the planet, and these 30 active systems, and 19 have erupted since the settlement of Iceland. So that's about 1,000 years, but those 19, some of them erupted over and over, and they're also not putting the simple fault lines as the one that was erupting when we arrived. When we arrived at the airport, as driving out from the airport, there were police and cones on the side of the road blocking us from going down to the Blue Lagoon, and we could see the lava glowing in the distance. So it's not this amazing eruption, it's just along a 5 or 6 kilometer fault line that's still to this day, and I don't think Vic will ever be able to be settled again. So the volcanic activity, there are two broad types of volcano. So it's the cone volcano, which we all know about, the steep cone where build-up of pressure and the gas just erupts. And then you have the other type, where there's just magma building up and then it breaks through the ground, and wherever it breaks through, it just oozes out. And in Iceland, it's oozing out at the rate of about 15 cubic meters a day along that specific fault line. And here you see one there. So it just oozes out of the ground. But the town of Vic, they're bulldozing, they've got big bulldozers just constantly trying to build walls to stem the flow, but they're not winning. And there's another image of it. The one in the middle is a extinct volcano which erupted, and then the whole lot caved in, and that's now full of water and in winter ice. So when we were there, everyone was throwing stones. There were stones all over it, and wasn't breaking the ice. 10% of Iceland's population at the moment doesn't have hot water because of all the piping, and that has been destroyed by the volcanoes. So here's your system from 1900 to the present. So those are just the ones that are blowing. This one here, in 2010, we had no guests arriving here for a whole week, and most of our guests are foreign. And that week we had no guests arrive because 33,000 flights a day in Europe were cancelled. And I'm sure most of you will remember that. It was a huge thing.
Say that word, yeah. Say that name.
Elatia Lefer Kjorko. It's the same name as the waterfall, I'll say it the same. So Iceland is not going to split into two because it's constantly moving apart at about the rate of 2.5 centimeters a year. But it's also eroding on the coast because of such harsh weather system and water systems. So Iceland's still going to be there for a long time. All right.
So how did we get there? So I alluded earlier, flew from Johannesburg to London and then on to Iceland. It basically took us 24 hours, actually over 24 hours. It's 11,000 kilometers away. Another way of doing it is actually if you wanted to fly to America from Europe, with Icelandic Air, they quite often do stopovers. So it's another way if you were going to do a whole round the world sort of tour. So we had a flight to London, Heathrow, then we got an EasyJet package to Heathrow, to Kettlebeck, and that threw in the accommodation as well. We were going to book car hire through them, but we did it actually separately because we weren't sure what the weather was going to be like, and whether we were going to have tours. But actually we were really, really lucky. The weather was really good. The other great thing is if you have a Schengen visa, Iceland is part of it. So travelling with a South African, quite useful when you have a Schengen visa, you can go to Iceland. So there is actually a lot of tourism in Iceland. They have 2.2 million visitors. Yeah, that is, yeah. There were quite a lot more people than we thought. We thought we were going out on the sort of something different. Obviously, in Europe, the main time that most people go is in the summer months, because from May, June, July you know, it's almost 24 hours, 21 and a half hours of pure light the whole time. So that's completely different from what we came to. You know, we had sunrise at 10, then you can see our noon, then the sun going down. And so it made the day, you know, you had your window of opportunity to see and do things. But we had a great time. Going on to the side, I mean, Iceland is about the size of Portugal. It's 500 kilometres by 300 kilometres, 100,000 square kilometres. It takes about, in summer, 17 hours, there's a ring road all the way around, to drive all the way around. But in winter, you know, the conditions are icy. It took us longer times just to travel shorter distances. But it is very, you know, doable in the summer. I mean, I think to avoid tourists, you go in the, you know, their spring or autumn sides of it. And the coastline is 6,500 kilometres.
Right, so the population of Iceland is about 350,000 people, and you heard that 2.2 million tourists a year. So you can imagine if you extrapolate that to South Africa, if we had that multiple of tourists, which we could have, given the fact that this is one of the only places really, if you want to see the big five. But anyway, that's another whole story.
Luckily the continent.
Yeah. So it's the most sparsely populated country in Europe. But the Icelandic people are a really hardy bunch, somewhat reserved and family orientated. They have a strong work ethic, a great love of nature, and an amazing strength in standing together in times of strife. The overall optimism is reflected in the attitude of Peta Redast, which means it will work out. So, and you'll hear later on in the talk that they've had a lot of times where they've had to accept enormously harsh conditions. You know, we moan about our load shedding and potholes and this, whereas that country it's unbelievable what they've gone through. They were spared the Black Death, the plague in 1340, but then in 1400, half the population died from the plague then. And then again in 1494, they built up the population back, another half died in the plague then. And then the Little Ice Age, from about 1645 to 1715, another half of the population died from starvation. It was all starvation each time and death from disease, but and they had a devastating impact on the country. But the traditional dish that they tell tourists about is rotting shark or fermented shark. What it actually is, when the people were starving, they would eat anything. So now they con tourists into, have our traditional dish, which is, we didn't try it, but yeah. Greenland has been successfully colonized by settlers from 986 AD. Just glancing off to Greenland now, because that actually goes below Iceland, which is all ice, except for two little bays in Greenland which have got grass. The rest is just glaciers and ice. Whereas Iceland, where we were, you'll see the pictures. No ice in the middle of winter and no snow in lots of it. So the expedition to Greenland was led by Eric the Red. He's quite the famous one. And his son Leif Erikson discovered America. Every one of the 5,000 Vikings who lived in Greenland, there were 5,000 at its height, every one of them died in the mini ice age from starvation. They couldn't get boats there for years and years, was just landlocked, as was Iceland. Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, is an amazing book on this whole thing. Okay.
So this shows the main routes that people do in the summer. As I was saying, that they can do that whole coastal route. If you want to do it in one foul swoop, it's 17 hours. We started our trip in Reykjavik, so Keflavik is where you land. It's a 45-minute journey to Reykjavik. And Reykjavik is dominated by its Lutheran church, which stands at 74 meters high. And most of the buildings, I mean, the old buildings, you see the corrugated and the corrugated walls and roofs. But now, most people live in actual flats, very well insulated. Yeah, flats seem to be the sort of the dominant scene in Reykjavik. Reykjavik is the most northern capital in the world, actually. And it's Lutheran religion is predominant. It's been predominant since they were shaking off the Danish Roman Catholicism. So they then went into Lutheranism in 1580. 74% of the population are Lutheran. Higher statistic actually believe in elves and trolls, supposedly. But anyway, we'll get into that later. And the other thing about churches that we found in this time of year, in December, you can see the streets. They haven't got that many Christmas lights. I thought there'd be more Christmas lights because they've got free electricity, not like us. So anyway, what they do in their churchyards when you're driving along, and it's really bizarre, driving along, and all the gravestones have got lights on them. They're all lit up with blue, red, yellow. I find it quite sort of weird, but actually it's a very wonderful thing because what they're doing is they're honouring their loved ones, and they have a very strong family. As you can see, they're a hardy lot. They have to have stuck together, so they're honouring their loved ones. And actually, traditionally around that December time, December 24th and New Year's Day, they quite often congregate in the cemeteries to honour their family. So after Reykjavik, we did the Golden Circle. It's a 240-kilometre trip round. We headed off to Thingvellir. That was where the first parliament was created in 930. Iceland claims to have, and I think, well, it is, has the oldest parliament in the world. So from 930, they congregated there at Thingvellir, and there's on these two tectonic plates, which are actually moving apart. So that area of Iceland is actually expanding. 2 centimetres a year, actually. The sides of Iceland are eroding, so it sort of balances out a bit. So they lasted the parliament there till 1798, and then from there, so this is Thingvellir, this area here behind, and we watched the sunrise at 10 o'clock. Then we moved on to Giza, Gullfoss, and then to Kerrid. So this are the two tectonic plates that you can walk through at Thingvellir. The geysers, the word geyser came from Iceland. Surface water has sunk down and hit the magma underneath, and then that pressure is built up, and then it comes through fissures up and out. We stood waiting to watch this. And it goes like you're not sure, every 5 to 10 minutes. It's sort of so it was spectacular. And so it's that whole sort of contrast of ice, bubbling water. It was just amazing surroundings.
Quite impressive. Well, if you're downstream there now.
Right. The southern route that we travelled on wasn't that far, 190 k's, but it takes quite a while because you're stopping for just endless waterfalls and glaciers and things. And Vik down at the bottom is that part of the country where there's 2.2 meters of rain a year. So the southern route is along the south coast, and the towering Seljalanda Foss waterfall. And that one you'll see quite a few pictures. And the foss at the end, I presume, means waterfall, because all the waterfalls seem to have foss at the end. And also the accessible tafel, and tafel means flat, I presume. So glaciers were called tafels. That's also an amazing sight, which you'll see a picture of. Black beaches, so the sand is just black, black, black from the volcano. And then you've also got diamond-covered beaches. So it looks like diamonds because the glacier ice washes up on the beaches and it just sparkles. And it doesn't melt very fast because it's pretty chilly. So, okay, so the waterfalls. This is a waterfall that I mentioned just now, and that one is only 100 meters away. So these waterfalls, there's a whole wad of waterfalls here, they're all coming off a glacier. So it's not just rain, it's glacier melt, snow melt, everything melt.
And they don't freeze winter.
They do. Look at this one. Well, no, some of them do, some don't. I don't know exactly how it works. It's altitude, I think, too. This one here is the big, big waterfall. It doesn't look big here because it's difficult to get scale. But this waterfall is absolutely massive. There's a waterfall there, and here's a waterfall, and this is hundreds of meters, hundreds. And there's about a 60-meter drop and about a 60-meter drop here. That's just mountain. So this thing towering over, but here it was really freezing. This was high altitude, 2,000 meters or so. But there is on the coast, and it seems to be fine. So it's a magnificent waterfall, this one. That's another picture of it with the view site up at the top. So the kids went up to the top, and here it is again. It's Jenna standing. And so all the ground here is just ice. You're walking on ice because the spray is landing. So yes, there was an odd slip and slide and all of that. So next we come to the glacier. So this is the glacier that I mentioned, Skafttafel Glacier. It's not far from those waterfalls, but it's the head of the glacier. So that's all this foot of the glacier is just coming downstream from the top of the glacier. It's not the biggest glacier by any means. The huge one is massive, 1,000 meters thick in places. So a kilometer of glacier. 8 kilometers long and 1.2 kilometers wide. So they're retreating at an alarming rate in some cases. More than 10% of the country is covered by glaciers. And the most visited glacier, this one, we had to walk a kilometer to the present foot of the glacier from the parking area that was built at the then foot of the glacier. So the parking area wasn't built that many years ago, about 50 years ago. But now you have to walk a kilometer because the glacier has just retreated to that point.
Cold wind.
Very cold wind. It was unbelievably cold. I actually not in this photo because I walked back to the car. I couldn't handle it. It was bloody cold. And yeah, I think you can see it's just freezing. And the wind, it's the wind that's howling is what really makes things cold there. Right. So the Aurora Borealis. Now this is the highlight of many people's trips to Iceland, because you can see glaciers in other parts of the world, like New Zealand, very accessible ones. And but the Aurora Borealis is really a sight to behold. So here, we were not far out of Reykjavik. There's the city lights, and you could see it. So it's not that you have to be in the pitch dark, but it helps. You get a far better view if you're out in the countryside. So I'll explain what the aurora is, because most of us don't know what it is, as we certainly didn't. Last year and this year are exceptionally good years to see the aurora. There are some years where people go for months without seeing it. So it just so happens that these 2 years are very good and people do see. We saw it. Not always. We went out every single night, glacier, looking. And there's just dozens of cars driving around at night, and that can only be tourists going to look at glaciers. They really are just stunning. Here, we just stopped on the side of the road for this photo, and there it is. And I presume if you've got a really fancy photo, you'll get a really amazing. So the lights we see in the night are in actual fact caused by the solar storms on our star, the sun, with the surface. And they give out huge clouds of electrically charged particles. These particles travel millions of miles and collide with Earth. Most of these particles are deflected away by our magnetic field, but some become captured in the Earth's magnetic field, accelerating down towards the north and south poles into the atmosphere. This is why aurora activity is only in the magnetic poles, north and south. These particles then slam into atoms and molecules in the Earth's atmosphere and essentially heat them up. We call this physical process excitation, but it's very much like heating a gas and making it glow. What we are seeing, therefore, are atoms and molecules in our atmosphere colliding with particles from the sun. The aurora's characteristic wavy patterns, which you see all over, is the waves, which is quite amazing. And curtains are light are caused by the lines of force in the Earth's magnetic field. The Earth's magnetic field is what's causing that. So we can't see the magnetic field, but that's what's causing the aurora. All right. Is there another picture? Right.
So as you said, weather, as we know here, is very influential in all our lives. It's a bit more influential at the moment with us, with our weather systems. But in Iceland, it certainly shapes them, and they are very aware, being on an island, so aware, I mean, that it's come into their language, that you have 156 words for wind. I mean, so wind is, well, as you might have seen in some of the photos, it took down the temperature. So it was, you're looking at the temperatures as sort of -1, but you could go at least another 10, 15 below with the wind chill. It was, and it was, certain places it was really howling. There isn't that much protection. The whole island is shaped obviously by its tectonic plates, its volcanic action, but also by the weather. And I say wind and snow, they've got 46 words for snow. 156 for wind, yeah, that's right. Yeah. But the southern side of Iceland is actually relatively, well, I say we experienced 4 really nice days in December. It didn't rain, just wind. And this is affected by the North Atlantic current. So certainly the southern side of Iceland benefits the most. Then you can see, I mean, like Greenland, actually Greenland really should be called Iceland. They really conned the people when they said it was Greenland. And so we were actually very surprised that there wasn't sort of deep snow in December. Reykjavik had a bit of a small covering, but and then out, yes, there was snow. I mean, ice was the main thing, caused by just that sort of cold current.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to tell you about the Viking settlement history. Iceland was still uninhabited long after the rest of Western Europe had been settled. The oldest written source, it's called the sagas. It's quite famous, the sagas. They were only written about 250 years after the first settlers got there, but it recorded their history. It sets the period of history at 870 to 940 AD, as we said earlier. And the first permanent settler, they left Norway because they were looking for religious freedom, which is the cause of a lot of settlers. I mean, our Huguenots came here because of religious freedom. And these early settlers, but they must have had a very powerful leader, because when they arrived there were about 400 of them. They camped in a particular spot as a temporary measure. He threw over some totem poles, and he said, wherever these land, we're going to build our settlement there. They searched for them for 3 years, and they landed at Reykjavik, so that's why Reykjavik. Vik is called, means bay. So they landed at Reykjavik. So after 3 years of camping in this, they eventually moved to Reykjavik. And the men in his group said there are far better places to make a city, or a capital, or whatever it is. But he insisted that it was Reykjavik. And they went there with their wives, slaves, and it also says, and some more wives from England. So I presume these were unwilling wives. So life back then, I think, was pretty rough.
For a while.
Yeah. the English slaves from England, or actually it's not England, it's Scotland and Ireland where they took people from. The slaves from Ireland and Scotland were called thralls. So I don't know if that expression in thrall comes from. But and Reykjavik means Bay of Smoke. The Vic at the end, Bay, and Reykjavik, obviously Reik. We all know in Afrikaans what that means. So the history of Iceland. The first parliament, as Sue said, was at that fault line. And the reason they did it in the fault line was because it was protected from the wind. So while we were walking down the path that you saw on that fault line, a few months before that, they said part of the path had just disappeared because of the constant tectonic action. So it's quite a bizarre setup there. And the early history, despite being ruled, they were just ruled by chieftains or prominent people. But they managed to throw off Danish rule in about 1874 to gain self-rule. But during the early 15th century, with the pack ice I mentioned earlier, that they became increasingly isolated from Scandinavia, and thus, through being cut off, they managed to eventually just not need Denmark, and Denmark didn't feel like invading them, so they managed. But there was no sea ice anywhere around Iceland in 1200, so presumably it was a warm period. So everyone talks about us getting warmer and warmer, but they were never landlocked by ice at all in winter. Then from 1200 to 1400, there was 40 weeks, 8 weeks from 1200 to 1400, and then 40 weeks a year from 1600 to 1900. 40 weeks a year. It was just pretty well landlocked with ice. Most of our ancestors left Europe in the 1800s, so I think you can tell it was pretty rough in Europe at that time. Icelandic is a Nordic language and is most closely related to the dialects of Norway. And they can still read their sagas written in 1130 because the language hasn't developed very little compared with Norway and Denmark and that. They still speak pretty similar the way they spoke then. It would be like us being able to read the Canterbury Tales with ease. An interesting snippet about Iceland is that in the year 1477, a young Italian sailor visited Iceland. So it's Italian sailor. Eh? Scholars believe that he had heard rumors of Vinland, which these Vikings had been in since 985, I think it was. He heard rumors of this place called Vinland. So for the next 20 years, he kept this with him. And eventually he was able to pursue his idea in 1492. Any ideas who he was? Christopher Columbus. So people have often just wondered, how did he just head off? Well, because he was actually in Iceland, and everyone in Iceland knew about this land to the west. I mean, yeah. All right, next we've got turf houses. The early settlers, because of the extreme cold and not having ISO board and electricity and heating and that, put earth around their houses to protect them. And I think these are just more modern samples, and no one lives like that now. But you do see very, very modern, very impressive houses. So the turf houses were a very good measure in the early days, and they used wood to make the houses. All right, next we've got World War II. So World War II was a pivotal moment in Iceland's history. Up to World War II, they'd really been poverty-stricken. The story goes that before 1900, a lot of the rural people would just get into an overall, a sheep-clad overall, and stitch it up with a flap at the bottom, and that would be them for winter. So I think they had a really, really rough time. Yeah, couldn't have been very interesting. And then with the enormous influx of Allied troops in the war, 25,000 British troops and 60,000 USA troops. So the population was only about 120,000. So this is way more than half the population. But how many eligible ladies would there have been in Iceland? So a whole lot of women left Iceland after the war who just married these sailors, and that's why the airport is 45 k's or 45 minutes drive out of Reykjavik. because the Iceland government during the war said we're not having this, and moved all the troops and the thing to 45 minutes drive away from their capital. Iceland was actually a founding member of NATO, even though they got no army, only a coast guard. All right, the economy. So, fishing industry was huge there. John Muir's daughter packed fish there in about 1990 something. Lots of youngsters went off to Ireland and packed fish. It was a very big industry. And nowadays, the foreigners that they're using there are Ukrainians. Everyone who worked in our hotel, we asked them where they were from, and everyone was from Ukraine. So fishing was part of the big main industry. Farming with sheep, and that was a small industry. Greenhouses, which we'll see on the next slide, and this one, are massive industry there. So here's your greenhouse. All those things on the top are lights, and down the bottom is a geothermal power station. But as I said, most electricity, 70% comes from hydroelectric. But that makes aluminium. It's a major aluminium smelting country because of the cheap electricity. So here we've got the greenhouses. When you're driving by at night, this is what the greenhouses look like to keep them warm because electricity is so cheap. And this is the price of petrol. Is 320 krona. So for 31 liters, 10,000. I had trouble trying to jet because I want to know how much you want to spend. And you have to do some serious maths because 10,000 sounds like a heck of a lot.
How much is it?
It's 8 to 1. Or you get 13 of their krona for 1 rand. So it's quite positive to go to a country. The greenhouses use no pesticides or herbicides because of the cold, and the soil is sterilized by the hot boiling water. So they used to grow bananas there, huge amounts of bananas. They don't now. Presume it's cheaper to get it from Barbados and that. And 99% of the electricity is from renewables. Banking is a massive industry there, but it got a bit out of hand in 2008 with a credit crunch. The krona plunged 70%. So we moan about our rand, but 70%, and their stock market crashed 90%. Okay.
So Iceland is very unusual in the sense that the Christian name is how you greet everyone, even the president. Really nice and relaxed like that. And that you then take on your father's name. So you hope he's got a nice name. And so, like in our family, Robbie wouldn't be Robbie Ross, he'd be Robbie Paul's son, because he's a son of Paul. And my daughter would be Jenna Paul Dottir. So she would actually have a different surname to her brother. And obviously the wife just keeps her name. So and now, if you want to introduce a new name, you have to pass it by their committee. So they're quite sort of strict on the sort of Christian names that they do allow.
All right, food in Iceland. So we mentioned the sheep's head earlier. So that's also a tourist trap, trying to tell people, well, they would have had a hard time in the early days and eating sheep. Most of their sheep died out in about 1700, so they brought in reindeer, which also flourished there. At the bottom left is the fermented shark, and this is salmon. And next one. So here's your fermented shark hanging up, all ready for some tourists. Your cinnamon bun is a big treat there. And this is the flatbread with lamb. That's a big item there. Sliced smoked ham. So food is very expensive there. We booked bed and breakfast. So we had a very healthy breakfast in the mornings.
Was that a schnapps with it?
That is a schnapps. They've got their own special schnapps, 37% alcohol, and it's a chaser. So they've got a special Icelandic. Reforestation. So when the first Vikings settled in Iceland in 940, they found a countryside covered in birch trees and grassland. So the trees had obviously been growing for thousands of years, so there was no problem. They used the wood for fires and provide heating. Birch makes excellent charcoal, so they made charcoal. And they used the planks for building houses and ships and boats. And then there was no wood, just like Easter Island. So they took tens of thousands of years to cover the land, and then only a few hundred to pretty well decimate it. Forests cover basically 1% of Iceland at the moment. So now there's these huge programs to try and repopulate the countryside with trees, but it's very difficult to get trees to grow there because of the cold. So it's taking a long time, and a lot die. And I've seen a picture of a hill, a conical hill, and behind it they'd covered the whole area with trees. And then after some huge gale, just a thin line of trees remained. Everything else was just destroyed. So about 40% of the country is now classified as severely eroded. That's really amazing. And the sheep, cattle, goats, they got rid of goats because they're really bad. And the horses led to the reduction of vegetation from 54% to the present 28%. So 28% has vegetation, but only 1% is covered by trees.
So, as I alluded to earlier, they believe in elves and trolls, which I thought was lovely. You know, they're a country which has...
Sorry.
No, that's fine. You know, they have long periods of darkness, so they have a real tradition of storytelling, and actually that's been passed down from generation to generation. So I was on the lookout every day for an elf. I was convinced that I could see an elf, and they take them very, very seriously. I mean, it's you know, they will move roads, you know, because that you can't build there because there is an elf house. I mean, how many other countries do that? It's quite. Yeah, Kobe. He's a horse.
Trying to get himself a drive.
Yeah, exactly. Can't run himself here. So as I say, the elves are the hidden people, but I think we've actually got one of the queen of the elves here, because the queen of the elves is called Hilda. There we go. The queen of the elves is here. And there's a lovely thing about I mean, like, as I say, they move roads and things. Basically, if you deny their existence, it leads to bad luck. So you might as well believe in them. And they're just the guardians of the land and life in harmony. So, you know, basically, if you didn't want something built that way, you say, there's an elf house there. You can't do that. And then they obviously have trolls as well, because there's a land of contrast. Trolls you don't see, because they only come out in dark. And if they do get caught out, they get turned to stone. And again, I love this whole sort of moral idea around trolls. So you have, you know, these 13 trolls at Christmas, from the 12th to the 25th of December. And basically, if you're a good child, you can put out your shoe every day from the 12th to the 25th. And if you're a good child, you will get a little present in it. If you're not, the trolls will put a potato in it. And if you're really bad, they eat you. So there we go. Because trolls like naughty children. That's what they thrive on. So apart from you know, elves and trolls, obviously this is a magical land. It has a lot of horses. It was an amazing number of horses that we saw. We saw more horses than sheep. There's 80,000 horses on Iceland, 100,000 worldwide, 80,000 there. And it has remained one of the purest, oldest breeds, because from the 11th century, they banned exporting stallions. So if you wanted to have a horse from Iceland, it had to be gelded. They're short and sturdy because they had to come on Viking ships. so they had to stand on those ships, so that's why they're quite small and squat. They only, if you horsey, they're between 13 and 14 hands, 132 to 142 centimeters. So basically for 1,000 years, they have been very pure. They come in all different colors, and they are quite unique because they've got 5 different gaits. My horsey friends here, Sue and Lorna particularly, they have, so you've got Wartrot Canter, but they've also got this Tolt, which is a very, it's a 4-beat, and it can go up to 30 miles an hour. It's very, very comfortable. It's a four-striding lateral movement. And then they've also got what they call the skio, which is, they call it a flying pace, but it's really only for sort of showing and things like that.
Right. Right, the wildlife in Iceland is not very prolific. They've got the Arctic fox, which obviously came over from the Arctic into Iceland when it was just solid ice long ago. And that's a very beautiful fox. I don't know anyone who's seen one there. We didn't meet anyone, so I think it's pretty rare and elusive. You also see the reindeer, as I said, which were introduced in 1700. But the highlight in wildlife is to see the puffins. There's about 10 million puffins, and they mainly live on the islands. But in summer, if you're there, they're just wandering around. They come into the town of Vic, and you're just wandering around with lots of puffins. So the 10 million in Iceland are 60% of the world's puffin population. So
Can they fly?
no, I don't think so.
Like a penguin.
They're more like a penguin.
Yeah.
I don't think they classify as a penguin, but I'm not sure. But they just swim. So basically they climb onto these islands because they're pretty safe there. And there's no predators in Ireland. That's the other Iceland. That's the other big thing. So, well, aside from the fox. And that rounds up the talk.
So thank you very much, everybody, for listening to us, and thank you very much for coming to Ardmore. I hope we've given you a bit of insight into Iceland. We had a wonderful time, and it's just an interesting, diverse country, and we were really privileged to have gone there.
Yeah, sorry. We're going to run a slideshow. Sorry, any questions?
Do they do any sport there?
Yes, they do. they
That's like you.
They do wrestling. They have their own sort of
Icelandic
Icelandic wrestling. It's quite popular, and they also have like a handball.
Swimming?
But a lot of people and swimming, and a lot of, they're very active, going out sort of fishing, out into the countryside, hiking. They're very much sort of at one with their country, nature.
But they're very big on outdoor. That you see all these huge Land Cruisers are very big there with big tires, and that goes out into the tundra and that. But if you look at the maps of Iceland that we see, you'll see it later. You won't see too many roads into the middle. Everything is sort of concentrated out on the edge and in the south. But there's a lot of driving around cross country. So yeah.
Did you have a hot bath?
Slightly smelling of sulfur, because from what I can gather, the water is private, is just supplied to everywhere, and it's used for heating, your shower, your bath, anyone that needs water. We didn't quite gather how they do your drinking water, but I presume that's from a different supply. But the hot water is simply from geothermal. And the reason that Blue Lagoon exists, it's one of the most famous sites in Iceland, which we didn't get to because it was, lava was flowing into it, is they had a geothermal power station, and one of the boreholes they dug down to bring up the hot water. So they just pump water down and it comes back up superheated. They hit a source of water underneath, and it just flooded all the area around the So it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere. When you see pictures of the Blue Lagoon, it's all beautiful with the background. And if you look around, there's a massive power station within 10 meters of you. So it's quite an amusing one. But remember, their power station's just a building. There's no smoke or anything else.
Just a little thing about their family life. You know, I said that it's very predominant, but I love a little little information thing. Is in 1980 up to 1983, there was no TV on Thursdays because they thought everyone must, family time. You must communicate with your family, and in July you must be out. Out roaming and doing things. So there was no TV up until 1983. Anyway, so you were going to ask a question. So that was another interesting thing that it was bad, because it was banned from the early 1900s. They believed that, certainly that it might make people aggressive, but also that they wanted to get away from the sort of Danish influence. But at that time, sort of those early 1900s, there was quite a lot of prohibition of alcohol throughout the world, especially in the States as well. But they carried it on, and now it's 1989. Yeah, it's celebrated on the 1st of March. They have this big beer day.
Anyone else? All right.